From the first days of the bloody war with the Soviet Union, the German aces, the pride of the Luftwaffe, faced a completely unexpected and extremely unpleasant problem: the mass use of aerial ramming by Soviet pilots. This risky method of aerial combat, where damage to the enemy aircraft is inflicted by direct physical contact between elements of the attacking aircraft and the target, had been known since World War I, but its mass application on such a scale was a complete surprise to the Germans. The first to venture such a desperate step was the Russian pilot Pyotr Nesterov, who shot down an Austrian Albatross in early September 1914. Unfortunately, Nesterov himself died in the collision, sacrificing his own life for victory. The second recorded ramming, which occurred about 6 months later, was more successful. The German aircraft was completely destroyed, and the brave Lieutenant Kozakov managed to successfully land his damaged moraine and remain alive. It is surprising that such a valuable and exemplary experience, demonstrating the high efficiency of ramming, was not properly taken into account by the German command, which clearly underestimated the capabilities and determination of Soviet pilots. Rammings were used not only on the Eastern Front, but also in the skies of Spain, over occupied Poland, and in the airspace of Finland, where Soviet pilots also demonstrated their readiness to go to extremes for the sake of victory. English pilots defending their airspace also occasionally resorted to ramming, repelling Luftwaffe raids, but such cases that were extremely rare and were more of an exception. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, aerial rammings became a mass phenomenon and an integral part of the air war, terrorizing German pilots. Information about the first aerial rammings of the Great Patriotic War varies in different historical sources, which is quite understandable due to the chaos and confusion of the first days of the war. However, according to Military Review, 15 minutes after the start of hostilities, namely at 4:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, Junior Lieutenant Kokorev, whose machine guns on his MiG-3 fighter failed due to a malfunction, showed courage and resourcefulness by cutting off the tail of a Dornier Do-215 bomber with the blades of his propeller. This was one of the first acts of heroism, demonstrating the determination of Soviet pilots to fight to the end. At the initial stage of the war, the German pilots, who considered themselves the elite of the Air Force, condescendingly laughed at the Soviet pilots. But their self-confidence did not last long, literally until the first serious and bloody clashes soon, not far from the Belarusian town of Zambrov, just 10 minutes after the first ramming. At 4:25 a.m., Lieutenant Ivanov repeated Kokorev's feat, having completely exhausted his ammunition, ramming a Heinkel 111 bomber with his I-16 fighter in the sky over Ukraine, demonstrating his courage and contempt for death. On the first day of the war alone, the German Air Force suffered significant losses, losing 16 aircraft shot down by ramming attacks. And this number, unfortunately for the Germans, continued to grow steadily in the following days and weeks of the war. The Luftwaffe initially held the erroneous opinion that Soviet pilots resorted to desperate ramming only out of desperation, due to a lack of flying skills and the backwardness of their aviation technology. Indeed, in Nazi Germany, no expense was spared either on the development of advanced aviation industry or on the training of highly qualified and professional pilots, considering its aviation to be the best in the world. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with his ideology and his belief in his own infallibility, stated, "The Slavs will never understand the true essence of air warfare. This is the weapon of powerful people, the German form of combat." His comrade and henchman Hermann Göring, no less self-confident and ambitious, echoed him, singing along. "No one and never will be able to achieve air superiority over our German aces." However, as harsh reality showed, the true reason for the mass use of rammings lay elsewhere. The Germans grossly underestimated the tenacity, steadfastness, unwavering will to win, and willingness to self-sacrifice of Soviet pilots, who surpassed them not only in courage but also in strength of spirit. A huge role was played by the difference in mentalities. If a German pilot, having completely exhausted his ammunition, considered his duty fulfilled and returned to his airfield with a sense of duty accomplished, then a Soviet pilot considered it his sacred duty to stop the enemy by any available means, even at the cost of his own life. I ask you not to forget to subscribe to my channel and like this video, so that you can learn even more interesting and little-known facts and details about the tragic events of World War II and the opinions of various parties directly involved in this global conflict. As a result, after collecting and carefully analyzing statistical data for the first, most difficult months of fighting, Hermann Goering, realizing the full seriousness of the problem, issued a circular on November 5, 1941, to all flight units without exception, with a categorical demand. It is strictly forbidden to approach Soviet aircraft closer than 100 meters in order to avoid a ramming strike, which can have fatal consequences. In the following year, the situation not only did not improve for the Germans, but worsened even more, despite the fact that Soviet pilots gained invaluable combat experience in heavy air battles and received more modern aircraft. The number of rammings only increased. Reaching its peak in 1942, they began to be used more confidently and purposefully, and on the new Soviet-made fighters, which surpassed German models in many characteristics. It was much easier and more effective to carry them out. Certainly, a significant role in the widespread distribution of this risky and desperate tactic was played by competent and effective Soviet propaganda, skillfully using the heroism of pilots to raise morale and strengthen patriotism. Pilots who dared to commit aerial ramming were hailed as national heroes. Their feats were described in detail in frontline and central newspapers. Propaganda films were made about them, and their names became known throughout the country. In flight schools and schools, future pilots were actively instilled with patriotism, loyalty to their homeland, a sense of duty, and personal responsibility for the fate of their country. Air ramming is, first of all, a clear manifestation of the readiness for self-sacrifice for the sake of saving the motherland. It is the last, most difficult and dangerous test of loyalty to one's people, one's ideals and beliefs. It is one of the highest forms of manifestation of the moral spirit inherent in the Soviet people, which the enemy did not take into account and perhaps cannot take into account due to his different mentality, wrote Alexander Novikov, Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force of the Soviet Union. In one of his numerous speeches, however, it should be emphasized that it would be absolutely wrong and erroneous to assume that pilots were directly called upon to make senseless self-sacrifice. Proof of this fact is provided by detailed recommendations on the implementation of aerial ramming, which were carefully developed in the Directorate of Fighter Aviation of the Air Defense in April 1942. In the preamble of these recommendations, it was said that such a form of aerial combat as ramming was inherent only in Soviet pilots, and this became their distinctive feature, and it was based not only on boundless devotion to their homeland, on ardent patriotism, but also on cold calculation, high professional skill, composure, and quick wit in an extreme situation. It was recommended to use ramming not only in cases when the fighter's weapons failed, but also when every second counted and a delay could cost the lives of thousands of people. For example, when an enemy bomber had already reached its combat course to drop its deadly load on an important state object or a strategically significant populated area. Even the real threat of a ramming attack could force an enemy pilot to abandon his combat mission, not wanting to risk his own life. German pilots were very afraid of aerial rammings, and having realized the intentions of an attacking Soviet fighter, they immediately changed the course of their aircraft and began to maneuver feverishly and haphazardly, trying to avoid a possible collision. The main idea of these methodical instructions was that aerial ramming, of course, is an act of supreme self-sacrifice, exceptional heroism, and courage, but in no case is it an act of senseless self-sacrifice. It was, first of all, an effective tactical technique, and pilots had to be trained in its correct and rational use. Further in the manual, there was a fairly detailed and visual description of specific recommendations based on the experience of real air battles and rammings. In particular, the manual strongly recommended striking the tail of the enemy aircraft with the propeller, since this type of ramming was considered the safest for the attacking pilot, especially on new Soviet-made fighter models with an elongated nose, such as Yak, MiG, and Lag, which provided better maneuverability and controllability. A wing strike was considered much more dangerous and less effective, as it was more risky for the attacking aircraft and could lead to its inevitable destruction. The detailed recommendations described which side it was best to approach the target from, how to carry out the approach, and what speed to maintain when performing this dangerous and difficult maneuver. The pilots were warned that before the inevitable collision, the attacking aircraft would get into a powerful and turbulent airflow from the propeller of the target, and it could only be held on the set course by actively working with the rudders and throttle while showing maximum concentration and composure. Valuable advice from pilots who already had extensive experience in carrying out aerial rammings in real combat conditions was also not forgotten. In particular, they strongly advised against unfastening seat belts before impact, as this could lead to injury and the death of the pilot. In much the same spirit, the legendary ace Alexander Pokryshkin, who became a three-time hero of the Soviet Union and left a vivid mark on the history of Soviet military aviation, also spoke out. He generally did not approve of the practice of ramming, considering them more of a forced measure, but did not fail to emphasize, ramming is by no means just bravado. It is not a senseless and unjustified risk. Ramming is, first of all, a weapon of brave, courageous, and masterfully flying Soviet warriors. Ramming required the pilot to have a virtuosic control of the machine and exceptional composure. Indeed, aerial ramming was an extreme and extremely dangerous measure, testifying to the selfless courage and readiness of Soviet pilots to sacrifice themselves for victory. But the chances not only to stay alive, but also to save their aircraft, returning to the airfield after the attack or safely landing it, were still quite high and by no means equal to zero, according to available statistics. During the performance of aerial rammings during the war years, unfortunately, about 37% of pilots died, which of course is a large percentage, but far from 100%. During the years of the Great Patriotic War, 598 Soviet pilots performed aerial ramming, demonstrating their courage, heroism, and bravery. 561 fighter pilots, 19 attack pilots, and 18 bomber pilots. However, the total number of rammings was somewhat higher, since 33 pilots repeated this desperate technique twice. 2. Terekin and Klobistov performed 3 rammings, and Boris Kobzon, who became a legend, demonstrated unprecedented courage and the highest flying skills, performed this difficult maneuver a whole 4 times, while remaining alive, and continued to fight heroically until the very end of the war. He became the only pilot in world history who managed to perform such a number of successful rammings without dying in the process. The only woman in history who performed an aerial ramming was the brave pilot Ekaterina Zelenko, who shot down a German Messerschmitt fighter on her light Su-2 bomber. Unfortunately, after the collision, the Su-2 plane exploded in the air, and the brave pilot died a heroic death. With this, we conclude our lecture today. Goodbye. I was glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to leave your comments under this video. Give it a like if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new releases.